So the concept national debt held by the public means all federal debt held outside the U.S. government. Okay, at the end of 2013, this amounted to about $12 trillion. The ratio of debt to gross domestic product is therefore 73% last year. That's not necessarily high for the U.S. government. It has been much higher in the past. This figure gives you a notion of that. Around 73%. Of course, during World War II, it was higher, but it had risen significantly. The debt to GDP ratio risen significantly during the recent recession for reasons that we'll talk about in a bit. Who owned this debt? Okay, well, the Federal Reserve, which remember is not, for this purposes, considered U.S. government holdings, is about 2.3 trillion. Mutual funds, private mutual funds, these are private individuals, 1.1 trillion. Pension funds, so these might be teachers' pension funds, which are holding so they can earn some interest. They're going to hold some of their funds in the form of government bonds. That's when we talk about who's holding the debt, who are holding the U.S. government bonds that are owed. State and local governments also are holding large amounts of federal government bonds. They do this to manage their own liquidity issues, and if they have cash flow coming in excess of their spending, they are going to hold some of that in the form of government bonds. Banks, insurance companies, private individuals and financial institutions, another 1.75 trillion. So almost half of the public debt outstanding is held abroad. And of that, 1.3 trillion is held in China, nearly all by the Chinese central bank. A very large amount is held in Japan. And holdings over $100 billion each in each one of these countries, again, often by central banks, but not always. Caribbean banking centers, these could be in the accounts of individuals abroad who may even be Americans for all we know. But they're holding them abroad in an account. The reason that so much bonds are held abroad by central banks is because the US dollar is a reserve currency, and central banks around the world are holding them as reserves, and rather than holding just paper cash, they'd rather hold bonds, which can easily be converted into cash because the US government debt is highly liquid, huge market for it, and plus you earn some interest. So the payment of interest to bondholders in 2013 was about $220 billion, and interest rates are very low. Therefore, the interest paid was lower than it would be if interest rates rose. So there's some concern that interest payments as a percent of total government spending may rise as interest rates rise. So a question that arises, does it matter if the U.S. government owes a lot of debt to foreigners? Not necessarily. It's what you do with the money. If you're doing it to invest in the future, it can be very beneficial. If you're doing it just to, for example, make transfer payments, that's not necessarily a great idea for investment purposes. Now, what about the distinction between the deficit and the debt? The deficit is the difference between federal spending and government revenues. So it is going to be equal to the change in the national debt that occurs from one year to the next. This will give you a view of how the national deficit, the federal government budget deficit, has evolved over time. What you can see is that the last time that we had a government budget surplus was in the late 1990s. And since that time, there's been quite a substantial government budget deficit. The increase in outlays as a percent of GDP is partly due to the increase in government spending that occurred. through the stimulus program and through increases in unemployment benefits and Medicaid, that because there were more poor people during the recession than before, and also due to the fact that as a percent of GDP fell, so the denominator fell. Again, revenues fell by more because fewer people are paying taxes. So revenues as a percent of GDP actually fell. It means revenues coming in fell more than GDP fell. That's for this figure to go down. Things have returned more or less to deficits that were more consistent with what we saw in the 90s and the 80s. Now, 4% is not unheard of in U.S. history. These were very large deficits as a percent of GDP. Now we're back to a position which is not historically out of whack with what we've seen in the past. The projections into the future are for worsening deficits. Much of this can be driven by healthcare, as we'll see.